watch these pituitary retards bang their fucking skulls together and congratulate you on living in the land of freedom. Here you go, America. You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you.
The president was shooting bombs overseas, yet I'm a bad guy because I've sang some rock and roll songs.
Where are we?
Cyberpunk as a genre has often been described as neon and corporate dystopias. But while the part of cyber, with flying cars, chromed limbs and huge neon billboards, is the aesthetic and most superficial face of it, scratching the surface we find the punk, a subculture and philosophy concerned with concepts such as rebellion, anti-authoritarianism, individualism, free thought and discontent, an expression of non-conformity and an opposition to mainstream culture. As William Gibson says, this anti-establishment and anti-capitalistic philosophy poses a conceptual threat to the status quo that punches up, unless you aim for a cozy subgenre filled with neon lights and no substance over the style. Although the motto of the cyberpunks is style over substance, Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk doesn't shy away from discussing the substance over the style, as cyberpunk has always been the battle of the powerless against the powerful, and a wake-up call that predicts the most dystopic outcomes from the social and political fears of modern society. A huge metaphor to show a future we don't want, but that may be too close to stop, because although cyberpunk was developed in the 80s, its structural themes still resonate almost 40 years later. The bending point that separates the cyberpunk timeline and a real world is the covert coup of the Gang of Four in 1989. A coup that took control of the American government behind the back of the elected President of the United States, supported by the power of the agencies that composed the Gang of Four, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA and the NSA, agencies that already acted on their own before they decided to join forces and take the absolute control. To maintain their power and authority, the Gang of Four invented threats where there were none. It was easier to have their agendas passed in the Congress in times of war, or under fabricated threats of terrorism, while the media in their power was used to convince the public opinion of the need to defend themselves from these fabricated perils, that in reality were mere excuses to invade exotic countries. The rule of the Gang of Four ended the federal democracy. Their power prevailed no matter what elections said. In the cyberpunk universe, the Gang of Four is mostly ruled by the CIA, an agency that was investigated by the United States government in the 80s under claims that they were involved in drug trafficking, an investigation that was quite infamous at that time. This agency has also been suspected of being involved and instigating wars without the knowledge of the American government. These two stories in real life were united in the cyberpunk universe in the shape of the Central American conflicts, wars manufactured by the Gang of Four to take control of the Panama Canal under the excuse to stop the influx of drugs into America. The second Central American conflict is the start of the stories of two central characters in the lore, the solo Morgan Blackhand and the rocker boy Johnny Silverhand, who, due to what happened in this war, decided to go political and started a career as a rocker boy. Climate change was also a weak point of the Gang of Four, as it was for the rest of governments in the world that didn't have policies to combat it. By the mid-90s, it was too late. Almost most of North America was a desert, and crops had to be farmed in Canada and Alaska. Most farms in the States were abandoned or expropriated to be given to the energy giant Petrochem, who needed them to grow the genetically modified yeast needed to manufacture the fuel of the future, the CO2. Petrochem had the resources to be able to grow crops in spite of the harsh conditions due to the climate change. But fuel generates more money than food, so soon naturally grown food was scarce, because money is always put before people. Expropriated farms were left with nothing. Now, 1 in 4 Americans is homeless. While Petrochem effectively profited from the climate change, we didn't reach that point yet in the real world. But we are no strangers to the subject of energy giants meddling with policies to combat it. From the late 70s and through the 80s, the energy giant ExxonMobil, back then only Exxon, funded research on climate change, helping advance climate change denial internationally, while it's believed that on Exxon's Environmental Affairs Office circulated an internal report to Exxon's management which said that the consequences of climate change could be catastrophic and that a significant reduction in fossil fuel consumption would be necessary to curtail future climate change. The parallels between Exxon and Petrochem survived to the recent days, as after a 4-year-long investigation, the Supreme Court of the United States allowed a case against Exxon, as they're accused of lying to the public and shareholders about the risk to its business from climate change, possible securities fraud, and the violations of environmental laws. Meanwhile, they try to clean their image by investing in renewable energies. Back to the Cyberpunk universe, another weak point of the Gang of Four was their foreign policies. During their rule, they managed to push aside friendly countries and break alliances, as their greed and thirst for power was put before diplomacy. The Gang of Four aimed to recover the glory of Americans' economy, but the losses of their international vendettas didn't help. So they hacked the World Stock Exchange to give the false impression of Americans' wealth. And when they were discovered, the news caused the World Stock Exchange to crash. Weakened by the losses in the world stock crash, overwhelmed by unemployment, homelessness and corruption, decimated by climate change, the government of the United States collapsed, falling into an economic abyss that turned it into a third world country. With all their allies lost, the government had no other choice but to ask megacorporations for funds to rebuild the country. From now on, the government of the states totally and ultimately bent to the power of money and the megacorporations who had it. The Gang of Four is the bending point that turns our real world into the cyberpunk universe. In the real world, the Gang of Four was a political faction composed of 4 Chinese Communist Party officials that were especially prominent from the mid-60s to the mid-70s during the Cultural Revolution. This socio-political movement in China that established Maoism as the main ideology inside the Communist Party of China, until Mao Zedong's death in 1976. During this period, millions of people were accused of being against the country and were prosecuted or suffered public humiliation, imprisonment, torture, hard labor, seizure of property, and sometimes execution or harassment into suicide. After Mao's death, his successor Hua Guofeng had all members of the Gang of Four arrested. But a pseudo-communist country that oddly enough has the biggest capitalist-driven expansion and is home to one of the biggest megacorporations of the world is not the only inspiration of the Gang of Four, as it was also solid criticism to the government of the United States in the times the first edition of the pen and paper game was written. Reagan had this same agenda as the Gang of Four to recover the glory of Americans' economy by passing the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, based on the idea that economic growth can be most effectively created by lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. Unfortunately, it didn't work, as it only served to accelerate inflation. During the Reagan era, as the Gang of Four did, the administration cut domestic spending and increased military spending, as the Second Cold War gave the American people a dreadful enemy to fuel their nightmares: the Soviet Union. whose nuclear power was used to daunt the American public opinion since the 50s. The Gang of Four effectively ended the federal democracy in the United States, but it wasn't until the government declared martial law in 1996 as a response to the upheavals caused by the collapse of the American economy. The martial law made painfully obvious how powerless the average American was. When America returned to civilian government in 2004, the rulers were mere puppets of the economic powers of the country, but they needed to keep the impression of democracy, while laws in which the only beneficiary were megacorporations were passed under the table, while the public was comfortably looking the other way. No system can be sustained without enough people believing in it, otherwise the government wouldn't be able to contain the social unrest. And making sure the citizens of America believe in the system is the job of the media corps. Network News 54, World's News Service. Their power expands to all types of entertainment: news programming, newspapers, films, television, series, comic books, braindance, everything you can think of. Is the Russian megacorp Sovoil pushing too hard on the American energy giant Petrochem? With enough money invested in advertising in Network News 54's programs, they will make sure every single action film shows how inhumane and cruel Russian enemies are, and every hour in the news is discussed how close we are to total annihilation for an atomic Soviet attack. So when the public opinion interiorized this message, they wouldn't call out Petrochem for the environmental disasters that they caused during the second corporate war against oil, but instead they will cheer the American corporation for crushing the common Russian enemy. Too bad they lost. The propaganda machine was also the most powerful weapon of President Elizabeth Kress to sustain her functional dictatorship after the Fourth Corporate War. The ravages of the war left America in pieces, and she needed citizens to unite in looking the other way, instead of what she was doing during her state of emergency. As it was not publicly known what happened at the end of the Fourth Corporate War in 2023, when a mini-nuke detonated in the Arasaka Towers, destroying much of Night City, it was the perfect moment for her to create a common enemy for all Americans. In spite of knowing this mini-nuke was detonated by the American company Militech, she used all her propaganda power to blame the attack on Arasaka and to paint a lurid picture of Arasaka as an evil foreign megacorp, run by a madman who wantonly destroyed an American city in the pursuit of personal power. Now Americans had a common enemy to keep them busy, and they would applaud when their government seizes all of Arasaka assets on American soil and Arasaka board members are declared terrorists. Using media to create a common enemy was the everyday bread of the 80s, although not something new. The Cold War that confronted the capitalist West against the socialist East was a resourceful birthplace of media and entertainment sensationalism that started some years after the World War II, when the Russians made public their development of their first atomic bomb and escalated after the Cuban Missiles Crisis of the '62. A confrontation that is often considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. Although nuclear power could be considered a very obvious theme in science fiction in the post-Hiroshima period, pulp fiction of the mid-40s also centered on a new subject: UFOs. Except back then, they weren't extraterrestrial, but Soviet spy satellites. The stories depicting enemies from the socialist bloc of Europe, especially Russian, both in the news and in fiction, reached its peak during the Second Cold War in the 80s. On the news and televised debates, the subject of atomic annihilation due to a confrontation with Russia was squeezed until exhaustion.
Destruction by nuclear war!
And on theaters, the peak of action hero blockbusters confronted Bruce Willis with East Germany terrorists in Die Hard, Sylvester Stallone with the Russian Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, Some didn't even veil their message like Red Scorpion, where the Russian protagonist, portrayed by Dolph Lundgren, sees the light. Communism is evil. And we could keep talking of The Day After. Red Dawn, film that oddly enough changed the baddies of the 2012 remake starring Chris Hemsworth to North Koreans. Octopussy, Rambo 3, For Your Eyes Only, Spies Like Us, and plenty more until the Cold War ended in the turn of the decade with the fall of the Berlin Wall and
Why attack Russia? Aren't they our friends now?
the quintessential enemy of the United States diversified. Russians were still demonized, but now they had to compete in notoriety with other nationalities. While it can be argued that the Cold War effectively inspired and intimidated culture from the 50s to the late 80s, the way the Red Peril was present in mainstream pop culture during the 80s, as it was basically everywhere, seems way beyond casual, mostly considering the generous military budget the Reagan administration needed for the Strategy Defense Initiative, popularly called the Star Wars. A missile defense system intended to protect the United States from attack by nuclear weapons. This defense system included a wide array of borderline science fiction weapon concepts, including lasers, particle beam weapons, and ground and space-based missile systems, and also high-performance computers that would be needed to control everything. These high-performance computers inspired James Cameron to create Skynet. After the Cold War, the usual baddies of mainstream diversified, but oddly enough, they keep tending to come from countries that are armed with nuclear weapons. The same way in the Cyberpunk universe, it was the detonation of a mini-nuke, quite modest in comparison, what turned Arasaka into terrorists in the eyes of the American public thanks to the propaganda machine of President Kress. It will be interesting to see how this subject will evolve in 2077 now that the common enemy is back.
If the Russian propaganda machine, both their state media and their bot and troll operations, is backing a candidate aligned with their interests, that is just a reality. It is not speculation.
And entertainment conglomerates don't shy away from showing their solid support to very specific political candidates. The influence of media corps in elections is another structural theme in the Cyberpunk universe. Media corps are the cement of democracy, as they are in charge of informing the general public of what's going on in the world, so they can make informed decisions about the political direction of their country. The delicate balance of power between the policies pushed by candidates and the interests of megacorporations make media corps deliberately push the parties that will benefit their economic allies the most. And if an elected official is not useful or even hinders the advancement of megacorps, they don't live long enough to be real trouble. The corruption of this universe creates a peculiar harmony, where the American public believes they are exercising their democratic right of choosing the best leaders, while in reality, the power play between megacorporations and the politicians they have in their pockets only allows Americans to choose between the agendas of one group of power or a different group of power. Candidates that rally with promises of solving the concerns of a specific demographic group, although such promises only take the 5%, if any, of their intended policies during their term of office. And if any of the 95% remaining schemes thought to help their economic allies are discovered by the general public, media corps will make sure they are brainwashed enough to believe that these policies are done for the gain of the American citizens, or even make them believe that those who are even less powerful are the real enemy, or will keep such citizens busy enough to not care about the actions of their administration at all. As media corps fail in their task of keeping the public informed, a counterculture of influencers emerged: medias and rocker boys. Medias are journalists that want to discover the truth and inform the public about what's really going on. The most influential journalist of the cyberpunk universe is the media star Tesla Johansson, whose report on the first Central American conflict led to the fall of the Gang of Four, and as a retaliation, he was assassinated the next year. Rocker Boys are similar to medias, but they use art as a vessel to reach the audience emotionally and passionately. Street poetry, powerful speeches, or passionate music, like the frontman of Samurai, Johnny Silverhand. The greatest lie of the American dream is that people are not poor, they are potentially rich, and being poor is just a transitory stage that they will get out of by hard work. In this dream, societal factors like the high cost of basic services like healthcare, the inequality of opportunities, the prohibitive cost of education, or any other factor that will prevent a poor person from stop being a poor person, are overlooked to create the impression of a false meritocracy. Is this sense of false meritocracy that gives the impression that the high leaders of the most powerful megacorporations are in their position for their own merits, a very well-earned position that is perceived as the result of hard work and not the result of economic privilege and unethical practices. Saburo Arasaka is a corporate god, respected for the fortune he amassed in life, while his Machiavellian ways of obtaining power through blackmail, using the Arasaka Bank, his exploitation of modern slaves to produce goods at competitive prices for Arasaka manufacturing, or his corporate police being the weaponized arm of the powerful in his Arasaka security branch, prove that one doesn't acquire this position, fortune, power and influence by being a philanthropist. Even less when the laws of the countries you exert influence in are tailored to make sure you keep your power. Why pushing the narrative of the American dream when the poverty on the streets make clear people in the major cities of America are not living a dream but a nightmare? Because no system can be sustained without enough people believing in it. And even the street rats that scrap out a living in the streets of Night City will side with the powerful corporates if you make them believe that, in spite of the misery they live in spite of their struggles for survival, this is just a transitory state, and with enough hard work the destitute can be wealthy. And all these fairy tales that are so easy to contradict. Soak, because hope is more powerful than reality. That's why Braindance is so successful and so addictive. The history of the cyberpunk universe was written almost 40 years ago, but it still resonates in our times. The same subjects that were discussed in the 80s are still current in Cyberpunk 2077. And we better learn from the cyberpunks to avoid the futuristic dystopia we are walking into.